I need to do this for my family. This is not a surprise to anybody. Pretty gutted about this.
It lasted only long enough to be dismissed as ordinary. No announcement followed, no palace statement acknowledged it, and no one publicly explained why Harry had spoken privately with a royal advisor. But behind closed doors, that brief exchange allegedly triggered a far more dangerous question. What exactly was Harry asking for? At first, there seemed to be nothing remarkable about it. Royal advisors speak with members of the family constantly, often about matters that never reach the public. Yet this conversation carried an unusual weight because Harry had chosen his route carefully. He had not gone directly to Charles. He had not contacted William. He had not approached the family through the most obvious channels. Instead, he allegedly turned to someone who understood the hidden machinery of the monarchy. Protocol, succession, private negotiations, family boundaries, and the delicate difference between asking for something personally and asking the institution to recognize it officially. Even more striking was Harry's manner. There was no explosion, no emotional demand, no sudden accusation. His questions were controlled, precise, almost rehearsed, and that calmness reportedly made them more difficult to dismiss, because it suggested this was not an impulsive conversation born from frustration. Harry seemed to have arrived knowing exactly what he wanted to ask, and just as importantly, exactly what he did not want to reveal. Then came the detail that changed everything. Harry allegedly began asking what would happen under a very specific future royal circumstance. He never fully explained why that situation mattered to him, but the questions kept circling around access, protection, position, family rights, financial arrangements, and what might survive if the balance of royal power changed. Individually, none of those questions sounded explosive. Together, they formed a pattern. The advisor reportedly began to wonder whether Harry was exploring reconciliation, protecting his long-term status, thinking about inheritance, or preparing for something much larger. The danger was not in one question. It was in the possibility that every question belonged to the same hidden plan. For a time, the advisor kept the exchange private, but the more its implications settled in, the harder silence became to justify. And once the advisor quietly raised the matter with senior palace officials, attention shifted away from what Harry had said and toward something even more troubling: why he had chosen that moment to say it. Royal families survive by controlling timing. Meetings are scheduled, announcements are calculated, and even silence can be deliberate. That is why Harry's private approach allegedly caused such unease. He had not chosen a random moment. He had spoken when several unresolved questions surrounding his future were already moving dangerously close to the surface. By then, uncertainty around Harry's long-term place within the monarchy had become harder to ignore. Behind palace doors, boundaries were allegedly being discussed with increasing seriousness: access to royal residences, invitations to important family occasions, participation in ceremonial moments, security expectations, and where Harry would stand during events designed to project unity. None of those issues existed in isolation. Together, they formed the shape of a future that could soon become permanent. Harry reportedly understood that once those boundaries hardened into precedent, reversing them would become far more difficult. A private assurance could disappear. A family promise could weaken. An informal understanding could be replaced by institutional rules. That may explain why he avoided going directly to Charles. His father remained the emotional opening, but approaching him too soon could force an immediate yes or no answer before Harry understood what was still possible. Then there was William. His growing influence created the complication nobody needed to explain aloud. Any arrangement made during Charles's reign might eventually be reviewed under William, and Harry allegedly knew that time could work against him. The longer he waited, the fewer options might remain. That was when the advisor began noticing something deeper in Harry's questions. He was not merely asking what Charles might allow today. He was asking what could survive tomorrow, what arrangements could continue if the balance of power shifted, what remained protected when one reign ended and another began. Suddenly, this no longer sounded like a simple attempt at reconciliation. It sounded like Harry might be trying to preserve a place before the institution changed around him. And there was a painful contradiction at the center of it. Harry had built a life away from royal duty, yet these questions suggested he still cared intensely about how the monarchy would remember him, where his family would belong, and whether distance could eventually become permanent exclusion. But timing alone could not explain the alarm. What truly changed the atmosphere was the subject Harry reportedly moved toward next, an old royal distinction that separates family belonging from actual institutional power. There is a difference between being royal by blood and being royal by function, and the palace has spent generations protecting that boundary. Harry allegedly wanted to know exactly where that line now stood for him, and whether it could ever move again without reopening everything the monarchy believed had already been settled. That distinction carried enormous weight. Harry could remain a prince by birth, connected to the family through blood, history, and identity, while still standing outside the working structure of the crown. One position was personal, the other was institutional. And according to the advisor, Harry wanted to know whether those two worlds had to remain permanently separated. His question was careful. Could a future monarch restore certain duties without restoring everything? Could Harry support selected causes, appear at specific ceremonies, or step into important family moments without returning to the full restrictions of royal service? That possibility immediately raised concern. To Harry, it could be framed as service without surrender, an opportunity to contribute while preserving the independent life he had built. But to the palace, such an arrangement could create something far more difficult. A royal figure with public visibility, symbolic influence, and selective access, yet without every obligation imposed on those operating inside the institution. The advisor understood the danger immediately. Royal precedent rarely remains isolated. One exception can become an argument for the next. A temporary accommodation can harden into expectation. And that appeared to be where Harry's thinking became more ambitious. He did not seem to be asking for the old arrangement back. He may have been exploring whether an entirely new category could exist, one created specifically around his extraordinary position. Close enough to serve, separate enough to remain independent. That would inevitably bring William back into the equation. Any agreement built during Charles's reign could one day restrict the choices of the future king. William might inherit not only the crown, but a compromise he had never accepted. The advisor allegedly made this clear, warning Harry that any exception granted now could enter the monarchy's institutional memory and survive far longer than anyone intended. Harry's reaction was reportedly calm, almost too calm, because instead of appearing surprised by the warning, he seemed to have already considered it. That should have ended the matter. Instead, Harry reportedly asked a second question, quieter and far more personal, bringing the conversation away from official duties and directly into the territory of inheritance, family protection, and his children. Until that point, the discussion could still be interpreted as Harry asking about himself. Then the names of his children entered the conversation. According to the dramatized account, the advisor immediately realized Harry was thinking beyond his own lifetime in royal service, and toward what Archie and Lilibet might inherit from a family they barely know. The shift was immediate. Harry was no longer questioning only where he stood. He was asking what his children might one day be allowed to become within a monarchy that remained part of their bloodline, even if it felt increasingly distant from their everyday lives. Titles were only the beginning. What about invitations? Ceremonial expectations? Access to family occasions? Would Archie and Lilibet grow into those connections naturally, or would decisions made during their childhood quietly determine how close they could ever come? That fear carried a different kind of urgency. Adults could argue, separate, reconcile, or change course. Children inherited the consequences. The advisor allegedly explained that royal blood did not automatically guarantee intimacy with the institution. It could preserve identity, but not necessarily access, influence, tradition, or emotional closeness. And that answer seemed to push Harry towards something deeper. He began asking about inheritance, not simply money, but memory. Family archives. Personal letters, photographs, private possessions, jewels, objects whose value came from who had touched them, worn them, written them, or passed them down. Then Diana's shadow entered the conversation without Harry needing to say much. He reportedly became especially focused on how certain possessions were controlled. Were they personal? Institutional? Could one monarch decide their future? Could another later change that decision? And if royal discretion determined access, what happened when William eventually controlled more of the family's private world? That was the question the advisor could not easily dismiss. Harry's concern may have been painfully simple, that Archie and Lilibet could grow up knowing Diana as their grandmother through stories, yet remain separated from the objects, memories, and traditions that made that connection tangible. The advisor reportedly understood the emotion behind it, but sympathy did not erase royal rules. Property, precedent, and inheritance inside the monarchy were guarded precisely because personal claims could quickly become institutional battles. Now the conversation no longer sounded like Harry seeking a path back for himself. It sounded like a father trying to secure something before his children were old enough to ask why it had disappeared. And that was when the subject moved toward the most emotionally dangerous part of the entire conversation, the legacy Harry has never been able to discuss without reopening old wounds. Diana. The moment Diana entered the conversation, everything allegedly became more sensitive. Harry was no longer discussing abstract royal rules. He was discussing memory, ownership, and whether the pieces of his mother's life that still survive inside royal walls could one day be controlled by people whose relationship with Diana remains deeply complicated. Harry's concern reportedly centered not on obvious treasures, but on the deeply personal objects that carried emotional weight far beyond their financial value. Letters, photographs, private keepsakes. Small possessions tied to moments the public never saw. Some had already passed into private hands. Others sat in a far more complicated space, linked to broader royal collections, family arrangements, or traditions that did not belong neatly to one person. That distinction mattered. Harry allegedly feared that Diana's legacy could change slowly, almost invisibly, as the monarchy passed into new hands, not erased. Reframed, the advisor supposedly tried to reassure him that Diana's place in history was too powerful to disappear. But Harry's concern went further. History did not need to vanish to be altered. A name could remain while its meaning softened. A story could survive while its emotional center shifted. And that was where Camilla became an unspoken presence. Harry did not need to accuse her directly. Any attempt to reshape Charles's personal story inevitably raised the question of how Diana would be remembered beside it. The tension was unavoidable. William made the issue even more painful. Harry could trust that his brother understood Diana's importance better than almost anyone. But understanding did not guarantee cooperation. Their damaged relationship meant even shared grief could become difficult territory, especially when private possessions and future royal control were involved. Then, Harry reportedly circled around one object in particular. He did not name it outright. Instead, he asked about a jewel or symbolic piece publicly associated with Diana, but governed by royal custom rather than belonging clearly to Harry's branch of the family. Who could decide where it appeared? Who could authorize its future use? Could its meaning be changed by how it was presented? That was when the advisor began to suspect Harry was not asking in theory. He seemed to be reacting to something specific. Then he stopped. No name, no accusation, no explanation. That hesitation was enough. Because if Harry was reacting to a decision he had not officially been told about, then someone inside the royal system had already been speaking, and the palace suddenly had a second mystery to solve. Harry's questions were suddenly too precise to dismiss as curiosity. They appeared to point toward discussions taking place behind palace doors, discussions he should not have known about. And if someone had quietly warned him, the secret conversation with the advisor was no longer the beginning of the story. It was evidence of a leak. That possibility reportedly changed the palace response immediately. Attention turned inward. Who had known about the discussions surrounding Harry's future? Who had heard conversations about ceremonial access, family property, private arrangements, or the handling of objects connected to Diana? The concern was not necessarily that one person had committed a dramatic betrayal. It was more unsettling than that. There could still be people inside the royal system whose loyalty to Harry was personal rather than purely institutional. Long-serving aides had watched him grow up. Some had known Diana. Others had served the family through years of grief, scandal, marriages, separations, and shifting alliances. For them, Harry was not merely a former working royal. He was someone they had known before the divisions became permanent. That kind of history could blur boundaries. When pressed, Harry allegedly refused to reveal where his information had come from. That silence protected the possible source, but it also placed the advisor in an increasingly uncomfortable position. If confidential discussions had reached Harry, and Harry had then deliberately brought those details into a private conversation, the advisor had become part of something much larger than a simple inquiry. William Circle reportedly viewed the possibility with particular concern. Their instinct was tighter control, fewer informal conversations, and clearer limits on who needed access to sensitive family decisions. Then, another theory emerged. What if Harry had never expected the advisor to keep the conversation private? Perhaps that was the point. He may have chosen someone experienced enough to recognize the implications and trusted enough to report them upward. In that case, Harry was not merely searching for answers. He was sending a message through the palace itself. He knew something, and he wanted them to know that he knew. Senior figures were suddenly left with a difficult choice: confront him and reveal their concern, or remain silent and see what he did next. They chose silence. But that decision created its own danger, because Harry apparently interpreted the absence of a response not as rejection, but as proof that he had touched exactly the nerve he intended to find. Behind nearly every modern royal crisis lies the same conflict: family emotion colliding with institutional survival. Harry's conversation allegedly exposed that divide again. Charles could hear a son asking not to disappear from his family's future. William could hear something else entirely: a precedent that might one day become impossible to control. That difference reportedly shaped everything that followed. Charles was said to focus first on the human cost. Harry's questions about access, family occasions, and his children did not sound to him like strategy alone. They sounded like fear. Fear that distance could harden into permanent estrangement, and that Archie and Lilibet might eventually inherit a family separation they had never chosen. William's concern was colder, but no less serious. To him, every exception created a future argument. If Harry could occupy a special position outside normal royal boundaries, then those boundaries themselves would become negotiable. And once that happened, every future monarch could be forced to defend arrangements made by someone else. That was reportedly the source of William's frustration. Personal disputes kept becoming institutional problems. Family pain became legal language, broken trust became protocol, and private emotion somehow ended up requiring advisors, lawyers, and carefully defined rules. Charles could imagine flexibility. William saw danger in the word itself. Catherine was said to understand both sides. She could recognize the emotional damage caused by total separation, while also seeing how undefined roles could create years of fresh conflict. Her instinct was caution without humiliation, but even that balance seemed difficult to achieve. Camilla's concern was different. Any renewed arrangement with Harry risked reviving old accusations, reopened grievances, and the Diana-centered tensions the palace had spent years trying to contain. What Charles might see as reconciliation could quickly become another battle over memory and loyalty. The advisor's account, therefore, became more than a report about one conversation. It triggered a wider question. What would happen if Harry eventually turned these private inquiries into a formal request? No one agreed on what he truly wanted. A return? Protection for his children? Control over Diana's legacy? Or all three connected by one larger plan? Then one detail from the advisor's recollection changed the entire discussion, because Harry had apparently used a phrase no one inside the room could comfortably explain away. Harry had not asked what could happen soon. He had not asked what his father might permit. According to the advisor, he asked what would still be possible after everything changes. 4 ordinary words, and suddenly the palace was no longer discussing reconciliation. It was discussing the future reign of William. That phrase reportedly transformed the meaning of everything that had come before it. Harry was not simply thinking about Charles. He was thinking past him, past the current balance of authority, past temporary promises, past the point when William would hold the power to reshape the institution on his own terms. For palace officials, that mattered enormously. Harry allegedly understood that whatever flexibility existed under Charles might not survive automatically under William. A private reassurance between father and son could carry emotional weight, but very little institutional protection. A spoken promise could be remembered differently. An informal understanding could simply disappear when the reign changed. So Harry reportedly asked the question that made the advisor uneasy. Could certain arrangements be written down? That was no longer an emotional appeal. It sounded like preparation. If access, family participation, protections for his children, or rights connected to personal legacy could somehow be documented, then Harry might be trying to secure something today that a future monarch would find harder to reverse tomorrow. William would almost certainly see that as a direct challenge to future authority. No heir wants to inherit a crown already tied to agreements he did not create. And Charles would be trapped in the middle. Protect Harry too strongly, and he risked limiting William. Protect William's freedom completely, and Harry might see it as confirmation that his branch of the family could eventually be pushed further away. Once again, Archie and Lilibet became central. Harry might tolerate exclusion for himself. But the idea that his children could inherit that exclusion appeared to be something he was unwilling to accept. Diana's memory made the stakes even heavier. Harry's fear was not simply about status. It was about whether his family line might gradually move outside the central royal story while the institution continued without them. At that point, the palace began to see the conversation differently. It may not have been a request. It may have been the opening move in a negotiation. And yet the most extraordinary possibility was still ahead, because investigators inside the royal household began asking whether Harry's real objective had never been a formal return at all, but something far harder for the palace to refuse. The final question surrounding Harry's secret conversation is also the biggest. What if everyone has been looking in the wrong direction? What if Harry does not want the balcony, the duties, or the old hierarchy back? What if he wants guarantees that survive titles, reigns, arguments, and even his relationship with William? That possibility changes the entire story. Harry may not be seeking restoration at all. He may be trying to protect something more permanent, recognition of his branch of the family, access for Archie and Lilibet, a continued connection to major royal milestones, and some safeguard around Diana's personal legacy. Emotionally, the logic is powerful. Institutionally, it is far more dangerous. The monarchy survives through discretion. Future sovereigns inherit authority precisely because they are expected to make decisions for their own reign. Permanent personal guarantees could interfere with that freedom, turning family reassurance into obligation. Charles might still feel tempted to offer certainty while he has the power to do so. But any written promise could deepen the divide with William, who may see it as an attempt to shape his future monarchy before he controls it. The advisor is therefore left between two uncomfortable truths. Harry's fears may be sincere, but the solution he appears to want could create conflict lasting far beyond the current dispute. For now, Harry has made no public demand. Yet the palace may already be preparing for the moment when he does, because the real danger was never one secret conversation. It was what that conversation revealed. Harry may already be thinking about the monarchy that comes after Charles, and the palace may now be wondering how much of that future he intends to claim before it arrives.